We're going to talk today about price versus cost based on this week's assignments. There's a lot of discussion about price versus cost out there. Let's start the discussion with what is price. Well, let's keep in mind in this discussion, cost is related to the seller and price is related to the buyer. Now, there is cost to the buyer, which is different from price, although it includes price, and that's an important discussion, and I'll touch on that towards the end here. First, price is what the buyer will pay. It's the dollar amount that must be transferred from the buyer's account to the seller's account. It may be on a contract, it may be on a barcode, it may be on an internet banner on your computer screen, it may be on a hang tag on the store, but it's the clearly discernible amount of money by a cash, credit, or check that's required to gain the use of that product or service. Therefore, price is actually pretty easy to define. Cost is a very big discussion because what is cost? Well, there's accounting cost and there's economic cost. And economic cost is something we're not going to deal with here. When we take economics, you'll see economics has a different definition of cost than accounting. Accounting cost is based on formulas and calculations, some of which are very definite, some of which are very much estimated. For example, the cost of a single 2x4 is pretty easy to determine, and the cost of 1 pound of steel in an automobile is fairly easy to determine. What about overhead costs? Overhead costs are the cost of the building, the cost of insuring the building. It's the cost of salaried employees. It's also the cost of marketing in terms of endorsements and advertising. Now, marketing has a lot of input in terms of what they expect to happen in the market. Marketing is not a perfect science. So we'll give an example here. What if through marketing you're expected and project to sell 100,000 units with an overhead allocation of $80 per unit, which is $8 million of overhead. And for nice, easy numbers, let's say you have an all-in cost of $200 and a selling price of $250, which, by the way, is probably too high for the typical margin, but we'll roll with it for this unit. So what if instead of 100,000 units, your marketing type blow it and you only sell 75,000 units? Well, your overhead per unit is now $106 per unit instead of $80 per unit. Well, this sounds like a lot of accounting and numbers, but hang with me a little bit here. So your all-in cost now is $226 per unit, which sounds like you're still making money against the $250, but, and it's a big but, instead of generating $25 million in revenue with direct costs of $12 million and overhead of $8 million, you now have revenue of $18.75 million, direct cost of $9 million, and the same $8 million of overhead, which leaves you $1.75 million, where before you were projecting $5 million. And while that's still net income, it's out of that net income that you pay back bank loans and taxes and set money aside for that next R&D project. So this is all to say that cost is not an exact science because cost involves guessing on volume. It's very easy to be off 10-15% on volume. You could be low, you could be high. High won't hurt you because if that's the case, you'll over allocate your cost, your overhead costs. But if you underestimate or if you over project and undersell, you could be off 20 or 30% of net income and your cost will not be fully recovered. So how does price compare to cost then? Well, what is price? Price is the money the buyer pays, which reflects their willingness to pay, which is based on value. Value is the improvement to the life of a person or a company from acquiring that product or service. Value is what a person gets by buying that new bracelet or that perfume or that car or that gallon of gasoline. Well, what's the value of acquiring an umbrella in August? Well, not that great in most parts of the country. What about April? Well, it's much greater in most parts of the country. April's a rainy season. Is the cost the same in those two seasons? Yes, it is. Is the price the same? Probably not. So what's price based on? Price is based on value. Value to the buyer is what drives pricing. Now in marketing, we should have done the research up front and we should know roughly what volume will sell at what price. And that was part of last week's discussion on what's marketing and sales and how do they play together. If you recall, both marketing and sales involve lots of inbound communication from the target market. And a big part of that communication should be about how the market values a product, how much they'll pay for that product at different price points so marketing can project demand. Remember I said last week also, marketing is applied economics, and that's where this comes in. At different price points, there's a curve of how much demand will be for that item. So now let's look at cost to the buyer as I referenced cost to the buyer up front. Cost to the buyer is price plus other expenses to acquire and use a product. Let's take two cars, a big sedan and a small sports car. Same MSRP, both with a complete 100,000-mile warranty, so there's no repair costs. But what about gas and insurance? Sports car gets 8 miles a gallon less, insurance is $700 a year more. Is the cost of these two purchases the same? No. Do they cost the same to build? Probably not either. Why are they priced the same? Well, because in a macroeconomic view, the buyers will look at all costs of acquiring, including pricing, and make a decision. What about those digital cameras in this assignment? Remember those overhead costs from earlier on? One of those is R&D, research and development. What happens to R&D costs over time? Well, they're allocated and amortized to each unit sold. And once a projected sales volume is hit, those costs have all been kind of paid back. They've all been absorbed. They've all been covered by what's been sold. So future sales actually carry a lower cost because we made up all that initial R&D cost on the first units we sold. What about the impact of demand? Well, think about why the demand for digital cameras may be lower today. And think about alternatives or replacement products. And then think about the impact on price when a camera, it can be replaced by some alternative device. And that what might be able to be sold for one price 3 years ago may not be able to be sold for that same price today because there's alternatives that exist, which might even be better. If you look at the camera on my cell phone, it takes pictures that are like 2 gigs in size. It's not like an 8 megapixel camera, some huge file. Not very many years ago, to buy a digital camera like that alone would have been a lot more money than it is today. Because today, those digital cameras have to compete with other devices, iPods and smartphones, just two examples off the top of my head, which can replace that item in the user's market. So, we know that price must reflect value. And when we're selling luxury items, a big expense is advertising. How much is spent on endorsements and advertising for that hand lotion sold in the drugstore versus the hand lotion sold at Nordstrom's or Macy's? I just saw this today on TV, actually, that the drugstore products are often just as good, but they cost a lot less. One reason they cost less is because the companies are not spending as much money on marketing and advertising or on packaging, and the volume is possibly higher. So we take all those things together, we find that pricing is partially based on cost, but let's also face it, that there is a certain exclusiveness to buying more expensive luxury products. So if volume is lower and overhead costs are higher, the cost per unit will skyrocket. Is there value to the buyer in driving a certain car or wearing a certain logo or smelling a certain way? Well, absolutely. And that higher price, which makes it harder for more people to afford that purchase, increases the intangible value of that item for exactly that reason. There is an emotional gain, a very strong emotional gain, for the buyer who can tell the world, I was able to buy that and I'm able to smell like that. So is price based on cost? Well, how you answer that question will depend quite a bit on how you define cost and the time frame of your discussion and your time frame of your calculations. But in either answer, no matter how you answer the question, you need to discuss the concept of value and that price is certainly and must reflect value in the market or no buyers will buy the product at all.